Hi, I want to show off a little thing I've been working on for a while. This is a CO2 monitor. I got it about 5 years ago. It's a bit expensive, but it does what it needs to do. It shows the CO2 value in the room, which is a bit high right now because I've been breathing into this thing for the last 15 minutes trying to record this. So CO2 value, it's got a temperature value, it's got a humidity value. It's got a button on the top, which you can use to go to a graph view, which would normally show a graph, but I've just rebooted this so it doesn't show anything right now. And it's all right. It does what it needs to do. It's got a little internal battery you can charge over micro USB. It has a runtime of, I would say, about 8 hours, which is all right. It's not ideal, but it works. And it's pretty cool. But I've been tinkering with it lately. I've been opening it up. And it turns out you can do some cool stuff with this. Specifically, if you look at this charging port here, USB has 4 connections essentially. There's a 5-volt connection, there's ground, and then 2 data lines. But you don't need the data lines for charging. You just plug it in and you make use of the 5 volts to charge the internal battery. But it turns out the manufacturer used those 2 data lines for debugging or for flashing in the factory. So they would put the firmware on this thing by just plugging in a custom cable and flash the firmware on this. But they didn't actually disable the debug interface after shipping it out, at least not on this model. So it turns out what you can do is you can get a USB cable, you can plug it in, and you can use a little microcontroller board like this one. This is a WaveShare RP2350 USB-A, and I've flashed the Pico Probe debug firmware on this. And I've configured it to use the 2 data lines on the USB port here as the debug pins. So if I plug this in and then I run a little command on my PC here, compile my firmware, you will see I will be able to put my own custom firmware on this, which I can make it look whatever I want and do whatever I want, but you can see it's got the CO2 level, it's got a temperature, it's got humidity. The temperature is a bit off because I'm not applying the factory calibration offset to it. And I can use a button to cycle pages. This is a very bare bones firmware. It's not very user-friendly. It's not very complete. But yeah, it has a little, it's got a little test, like settings page. You could go into this and configure settings, which currently is nothing. It's just a test page. But yeah, you can just make your own interface for this essentially. But the coolest thing that you can do with this, that I haven't done yet, and I would like to show that by first flashing on the original firmware again. But it turns out the original firmware has a little test mode, which you get by holding the top button when you power it on. So I've restored the original firmware here. Let me unplug the power here. If I turn it off, right, hold the top button and turn it on, I get this little test page. Which is quite cool, and it shows some interesting information. For example, it shows a hardware and a software version. So this is hardware version 1.6, which it reads out by just like something basically hardwired into the PCB. A software version, so maybe there's other devices with different firmware versions. The LCD model, and then a bunch of more stuff, including these here, which are settings, like factory calibration settings. So you can see the temperature actually reads out as 23 degrees, and it applies a -3 offset, and it shows 20. And you can change these with a button. I haven't really figured out how it works. It's a bit weird. You need to like double press, and then you go into an edit mode, but it doesn't tell you how to go out of the edit mode, and it's whatever. The most interesting stuff is at the top here. We can see CO2 equals yes, and then SHD20 equals yes. CO2 is obviously the CO2 sensor. I looked up what SHD20 is, and it turns out to be a temperature and humidity sensor. But it also shows some other stuff here, like this HCO value and PM 2.5 value, and then Wi-Fi, interestingly, right? And also here it says Wi-Fi 0.0.0.0. And to show why this is interesting, I will have to open this thing up and show you the actual PCB. All right, I took apart the device. This is the main PCB. We can have the display in the front, and on the back we have all the interesting components. This is the MCU. It's an STM32F070. This is the SHT20 sensor, which is used for temperature and humidity. These sockets are used for this CO2 sensor, which is a SenseAir S8. It's an off-the-shelf component. You can just buy this from the original manufacturer. They're still being made, and you could replace it if you want to. And then you have like, a battery socket connection. These are debug headers, which are probably used when they were developing the firmware. Some extra pins here for debugging. But all the cool stuff is stuff that isn't here, basically. The only thing that was on this board was this connector here. But these sockets, for example, were not connected. Were not populated. This is where the HCHO sensor would go. I managed to track down what module that is. You can still buy them original from the manufacturer. They were a bit expensive, so I didn't buy them. But you would be able to. This is a JST 8-pin 1mm connector, which they used for their PM 2.5 module, which is some kind of particulate sensor, I believe. And this is just a standard JST connector, so you would be able to use one of these cables, which I got from like some e-ink display. But this is just a standard connector, so I would be able to plug this in and hook up my own module to this. That maybe reads something entirely different, like, I don't know, alcohol in your air, in your breath or something. I don't know. You could hook up whatever you want, but the most interesting part is this here, this bit. This looks like a Wi-Fi module. You can tell from like the quiet area here for the PCB antenna. And if you look at this pin out and if you measure it out, this is a Espressive W room module. They match up perfectly, except for the 6 pins at the 6 pads at the bottom there, like debug pins or something. That's an Espressive W room module, and I managed to track one down on AliExpress. They're not exactly hard to find. They're very popular. This is probably the original module. It's from 2015. But they actually released newer ones, such as this one, which has a RISC-V CPU on it. And both of these, I believe, support Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, maybe Zigbee and Thread. I'm not exactly sure. But that's quite interesting, because we can just, even if we have one of these boards that doesn't have them populated, because some of them had different hardware configurations. Mine just has a CO2 sensor. Even if you had one that didn't have a Wi-Fi module on it, you can just buy one and just solder it on and flash it yourself, flash your own firmware onto it. I haven't done that yet, as you can see from it not being soldered on. But that's something I could maybe do in the future. And I could, for example, connect it to Home Assistant and then send all the sensor reading to Home Assistant and integrate that with something. And I think that's kind of cool. We were able to take an off-the-shelf CO2 sensor module thing. And we were able to like dump the firmware, reverse engineer how it works, write our own firmware, and even extend it with stuff that it wasn't originally meant to do. And I think that's really cool. And it shows that even if you buy something proprietary, you can often still do interesting stuff with it. Propriety just means it isn't documented, really. Everything's open source if you can reverse engineer at a low enough level. So I think that's pretty cool. If you have one of these boards or one of these CO2 sensors with a Wi-Fi module or with one of the other modules that I don't have, please let me know. I would love to see what they look like or what the original firmware on the Wi-Fi chip is or the Wi-Fi module. So if you know that or you have one of these, please let me know. I'll be willing to buy it maybe. And otherwise, all my research is on GitHub. You will be able to read what the pinout is for the chip, what all the other components are, where to buy them, etc. And you can find my firmware, which interacts with all those components. So I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, thanks for watching. Maybe my next video won't take 4 years to upload.